I started teaching in 1978. I was 5. And I'm a graduate of Santa Clara University, a Spanish major, and I got my doctorate at Stanford. And Bob started a few years before me. When did you start teaching there?
76.
So, yeah. So he's just a little bit older than me. But anyway, before we do anything, I really want to thank Stella again for organizing this. I've known Stella for a long, long time, since the California Mission Studies days, and there are other faces here in the audience that I recognize, and I'm so honored that you all came today. This is fantastic. I have a former student here, Greg von Herzen. He was in our very first translation course. I had this idea that students needed to learn about California history, but using primary source documents, go through those documents, translate them, and then hopefully get them published. Well, Greg was in that first class, and I had to convince my department chair that that was a good class, and he didn't want me to teach it, so I said, I didn't say damn it, but I said, darn it, I'm gonna do it for free. So I taught the class for free because it meant that much to me. And look I've got my student here, which is fantastic, yay. And there's another wonderful person here, Eric Plunkett. He's a fabulous, fabulous historian and a teacher, and we're working with Eric through our Before Gold series through the University of Oklahoma Press. We're series editors for that series, and we're working with him, and he's going to be publishing a book on Portola. And so we keep in contact so that he keeps moving on that. But when you see Eric, please encourage him. We want to get that book out as soon as possible. So thank you so much for being here, all of you. And as I said to a few people, nobody's going to sleep. I don't allow my students to sleep. And you're not my students, but when I'm talking, I don't want anyone to be bored. If you have any questions, we'll take them at the end, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. But it's just a thrill to be here today to talk about a topic that's near and dear to our hearts, and that's Testimonios, Early California Through the Eyes of Women. So, as I mentioned before, I taught at Santa Clara University, taught literature in advanced language, and one of the classes that I taught was a class in 19th century novel. I'm a person who doesn't want to go past like 1898. I kind of like live back in those eras, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. And in this class, the students read a work called La Gaviota, which means the seagull. Well, there was a quote in that book that really resonated with the women in that class. And this was the quote. La vida de un hombre es siempre historia, pero la vida de una mujer es siempre una novela. Can you imagine how the women in that class reacted to that? A man's life is always history, but a woman's life is always a novel. Oh, really? Yeah, right. Well, I'm going to talk today about the lives of women in 19th century California, and their lives were not a novel, but they were really complex histories that demonstrate that even in a patriarchal society, women actually did have roles that were super important. They had important positions of responsibility, and even at times they had positions of authority that were essential, for example, in the running of the day-to-day operations in the missions. Some of you are docents at the missions or were docents, and so you know how important women were to keep those missions going. It wasn't the Franciscans doing everything. God loved them, but it wasn't them. Well, I'm going to ask some questions. So it's no test, no final, nothing, but you can answer the questions if you like. Okay, does anybody know what this is? Anyone have an idea what this is? No wrong answer. I won't give you an F. It looks like a fireplace, kind of. It looks kind of like confessional.
Is it an incinerator?
Oh, God, I hope not. No, when you find out what it is, you'll be glad that it's not an incinerator. Actually, what it is, it's a foundling wheel, a foundling window. And what people would do is that if there were a baby that somebody didn't want, they would go and put the baby there in the window. I can't get it here. Right here. So they would then place the baby there, and then inside, you all know what a lazy Susan is, most of you do. There would be something like a lazy Susan. The child would be placed on that lazy Susan, and there was somebody behind there, a portero, like a doorman, and what he would do when he would receive the child is that he would take a look at the child, see if the child had any marks, birthmarks, or if there were a letter or some kind of identifying information, and then he would write down in a book if the child were white or if the child were not white. So they had this sort of casta system. Well, in 1793, a baby girl was left in a window just like this at a place called the Real Casa de Expositos, the royal house for abandoned children. And this particular baby girl was probably left at the Real Casa on January 1st. And the reason we think she was left on that day is the name she was given was Apolinaria. And January 1st is the saint day of Saint Apolinaria. So that was the name that was written down in the record book. Now, her last name was already determined, as it was for every child who ended up there. The last name was Lorenzana. And I kid you not, somebody actually asked me, was he the father of those children? No, he was not. I swear. He was the man who founded this home for abandoned children, and he was the Archbishop, as it says on the slide, of Mexico from 1766 to 1772. The story is said that he was in a carriage. He was being driven back to the parish church, and they were driving by an area which was basically kind of like a dump area, and he heard sounds, and it was a baby crying. They thought it was maybe an animal, but it was a baby. And so people were leaving their children, just abandoning them. They couldn't care for them in places like this. And he felt that this was obviously awful, so he established this Real Casa de Expositos. Now here we have, Bob will talk a little bit about the map of the area where the Real Casa de Expositos is located or was located.
So the casa was located only about 4 or 5 blocks away from the center of Mexico City. And that was deliberate because it was easy for anybody to get to deposit a child there that they didn't want.
This story captured our hearts, and I wanted to research more about it. So I found a constitution that was written for the Real Casa, and I'll show you that in a moment. But I found other information. There was a door connecting the casa to another building, and this was considered a hospital. So this hospital next door was for women who came from a privileged class, women who found themselves, as I like to say, in a bind, okay, or who had been put in a bind by someone, and she had to give birth anonymously. So what they would do is that the woman would come here to this hospital. Her face would be covered, so she maintained her anonymity. They would deliver the baby. There would be a priest there to baptize the baby. Then the baby would then be taken over to right next door to the Real Casa de Expositos. So it's a sad situation. But I mentioned that there was a constitution. And the children living at this place lived a very, very regimented lifestyle. They would be up in the morning at 6 o'clock every day. Every hour was scheduled where they had activities, meals, prayers, learning the catechism, mass, lessons in sewing for the girls, carpentry for the boys. And the goal of the casa was to help these children develop some skills so that they could find a place in society. Well, we don't know what the success rate was, and it probably was quite low. Here we have a census doc. In November 13th, 1799, the casa had 180 children under their care. That is a lot of children. And obviously, the casa had serious financial troubles, and they needed to reduce the number of children under its care. Well, the viceroy at that time, his name was Asanza, and he came up with this plan to help alleviate the financial problems. So he said, hey, let's send healthy children age 10 to California to help colonize the area. What were you doing when you were 10 years old? I was still playing with Barbie doll, I think. 10 years old. You definitely were not playing with Barbie doll, but you were doing something else, obviously doing something else. Well, in January 1800, 5 boys and 11 girls were sent from the casa, so from Mexico City to San Blas on the coast, and there they boarded a ship headed for California. Guess who was one of the children on that ship? Apolinaria. And she was 7 years old, she wasn't 10. So I'd like to know very briefly if you have a theory why they would send a 7-year-old girl. She wasn't 10 yet. Why do you think? She was troubled? Could be.
Acted older than her age.
Acted older than her age? It's possible. Smart? Yep. Well, you're going to find out in a minute my theory. 78 years later, the memory of that trip and landing in Monterey, which is where they first landed, still haunted Apolinaria. She said, we stopped in Monterey, and I saw my friends being distributed to different families as if they were puppy dogs. Here's a child, here's a child, here's a child. She remained in Monterey for a short period of time, and then she traveled down on a ship to Santa Barbara. And there she lived with the family of Lieutenant Raimundo Carrillo. Now, the reason I think that she was smart is this. In Santa Barbara, she's still 7 years old. She began to teach a few girls there how to read. So she learned how to read when she was in Mexico City. So she was teaching girls, and she was 7. And she also taught them the catechism. So I think that shows that she was very bright. Now, Carrillo reported on September 2nd, 1803, that this orphan project was really not successful. It was anything but successful. The children were a financial burden to these families where they were placed. And he says they were too young to have acquired any kind of skill. And at this time, there weren't enough people there to teach them anything. Well, somebody was useful to this country, to the California, and that was Apolinaria. She became more than useful. In Santa Barbara, she taught herself how to write, and she says this in her testimonio. She says, I would pick up books, I'd see them around, and then I would copy down the letters on any scrap of paper that I could find. And she said she would even pick up cigarette papers. Remember those old cigarette papers, and people would roll stuff that's legal, okay? And she would just get a piece of coal or something and then copy. So she taught herself how to write. I think that's phenomenal, especially when you see this next slide. There is her handwriting. There is her signature. And my poor husband knows, because I tell people this all the time, her handwriting is better than his. It's definitely
Which is true,
better.
which is true.
It's definitely better than his. That is phenomenal that she did this. She was extremely, extremely bright. At Mission San Diego, she was definitely more than useful. When Raimundo Carrillo was promoted to the position of commander of the San Diego Presidio, Apolinaria went with Carrillo and his family to live there. And she was about 12 or 13 years old at the time, and she lived there for a number of years. She eventually moved to the home of another military family, and that was the family of Sergeant Mercado. But she only lived with them for a short time because she became very ill. The fathers at Mission San Diego took her in until she had recovered sufficiently to return to the Mercado home. Now, when Sergeant Mercado died, Apolinaria stayed a little bit longer with his widow, but then the missionary fathers stepped back in and they took her back to the mission because they thought that she could work as a nurse in one of the hospitals that they had there. And you all know that when I say hospital, we're not talking something like Kaiser. We're talking just some rooms, for the men and for the women. But they felt that she could be of help. And she became the nurse for the women's hospital. And she said that by giving her that job, it was kind of an act of charity, but she was still quite ill and she could do very little work. What had happened, it was that her left hand became paralyzed. And I don't know if any of you are doctors here, and you might have a theory why that happened. This is a young girl. She was like 13 years old. And it was paralyzed for 3 years. She said it looked like her hand was dead. So during those years, she still was at the mission hospital, but eventually her hand began to recover, and she started to sew. She did embroidery on shirts and sashes and neckerchiefs and even more. And then she got more work. The missionary fathers trusted her so much that when ships would arrive at the port, they would send her down to the port with servants and a list of goods that they needed at the mission. And they also gave her the authority to pick out other things that she thought they might need at the mission. This was a young woman. Think about it. She was very young, but they trusted her. Now, Apolinaria never married, and obviously had no children of her own, but her legacy in part is that she served as godmother at more baptisms than any other person in Alta California. And by her own account, it was between 100 and 200 children. But she was also known as a woman who was genuinely kind and a woman who gave of herself.
Now, how do we know anything about her? We know about her because of one man who was named Hubert Howe Bancroft. He was a native of the Midwest. He came to California in 1852 as a bookseller and a printer. And he became interested in history. And so what he did as a bookseller and a printer is he started collecting books. And his printing business increased and was very successful. And he was able to get more books, and he was able to hire some people to kind of catalog and summarize those books. Now, his first inclination with all of these books was to write what he called an encyclopedia of the American West. And since his books that he had collected included a bunch of books on Mexico and Central America, his notion of the West was a multinational notion, which was very much ahead of its time. This is his building, the company. He founded a company, the Bancroft Company, and this is his building on Market Street. It was on 3rd and Market, roughly. And at one point, a number of years ago, Rosemary and I were curious about when we were in San Francisco, like, okay, what's there at 3rd and Market Street now instead of Bancroft Company? And you know what we found?
Super duper burger.
A super duper burger is there. Well, the encyclopedia never came about, Bancroft's encyclopedia, but nevertheless, he became something of an historian himself. And since his collection was large, his vision of history that he wanted to do was equally large. And he decided to do a history of what he called the Pacific States. And that was a large geographic region which went from Alaska all the way down to the southern tip of Latin America. And actually, he did publish eventually 39 collected volumes. But at the beginning, since he literally had thousands of books, and a number of them were in Spanish, he needed documents, primary sources, and he needed people who could read those documents in Spanish. And one of the first people he hired was a man named Enrique Cerruti, who was an Italian who had spent a considerable amount of time in Latin America, and therefore knew both Italian and Spanish. So that was the language part. Now, to collect documents, one of the first people he contacted was Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, who had a long and distinguished history in Mexican California. Vallejo had become, we'll talk more about him in our second talk, but he was a very important figure. He was military commander, he was head of the Presidio, he was a whole bunch of different kinds of things. And in the 1850s and early 1860s, as he was living in what was now U.S. California, Vallejo decided that he wanted to write a history of California before the Americans got there. He told Anastasio Carrillo, who was a friend of his, that, quote, "My principal objective is for our successors, the Americans, to understand that when they took over this country, there was a civilization and men who belonged to a race equal to, if not better than theirs. And if this work is not done, we will disappear and thus be disregarded by the entire world." Because he was aware of that most of the Americans who come in during the gold rush and after didn't know much about the Mexicans except one thing: they were stupid and useless. That's what they thought. And he wanted to correct that. Well, what happened is that in 1867, a fire destroyed his manuscripts. And when Bancroft, he still wants to do this history, and when Bancroft and Cerruti approach him asking for documents, he says, oh yeah, this is a good opportunity for me. He told the both of them, I'll give you my documents, but if you want them, you have to take down my dictation of my history of pre-U.S. California. He still had a lot of notes left from his manuscript. And he said, I can take you to other people who lived in California before the gold rush, other Californios. But if you want documents from them, you're going to have to take down their reminiscences as well. And Bancroft, desperate for documents, agreed to that project. And so what he does is he recorded interviews or transcribed interviews from a whole bunch of people. And this thing became a very complex organization. And this photo here shows some of the people who were involved in this. But of all of the interviews that Cerruti conducted, the first one that he conducted was of an indigenous woman.
Isidora Filomena. Now, on April 4th, 1874, Cerruti went to Lacrima Montis, which was Vallejo's home in Sonoma, and he went there to interview Isidora Filomena, who was the widow of Sem Yeto, better known among the Californios as Chief Solano. And he was Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo's important Indian ally during the 1830s and 40s. Cerruti was accompanied by Salvador Vallejo, who was Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo's brother, and by another individual by the name of Captain McLaughlin, and they served as witnesses to the interview session. Salvador had to convince Isidora that Cerruti was a kindred spirit because she wasn't sure she really wanted to talk to him. And he told her, well, this man has the same negative opinion of the Americans as you do. And Isidora referred to the Americans as the Bostons. So, now, I don't know who this native woman is. It may or may not be Isidora, but she must be somebody important because why would Vallejo be standing next to her with this sort of Napoleonic stance? So he wanted to show that I believe that she was important.
Now, she was the widow at this time of, as Rosemary said, of Chief Solano, who was a Sassoon Indian who lived in the North Bay region, right across the Carquinez Strait, and was a very, very important person in the North Bay region. And you can see in this map that Randy Millikan, who was a very famous and well-known and excellent anthropologist, did. The number of native people groups who were in the North Bay, and you can see that there were a whole bunch of them. And, not all of them got along with each other. And so what Vallejo was able to do for Solano is help Solano struggle against his enemies. And Solano was able to help Vallejo increase his power among the native peoples of the North Bay.
Now, I mentioned that Cerruti went to Lacrima Montis to interview Isidora. And the reason that he went there was because he had loaned her a small house near his home as a way of thanking her husband for the help that he had given him in different battles, etc. This testimonial is really important because it is the only testimonial by an indigenous woman. It's interesting to read this because the language in which Cerruti took down Isidora's reflections replicates her speech. Spanish was not her first language. We need to remember that. She had her own indigenous language. And he put down on paper the sounds of Spanish that she spoke. And many of the words that he wrote them the way she pronounced them. For example, the word Mexicano, M-E-X-I-C-A-N-O, she pronounced it as Melicano, M-E-L-I-C-A-N-O, and that's how he wrote it. And as a Spanish professor, I thought this was very interesting, but part of it bugged me too, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Isidora rarely conjugated verbs, and she used infinitives instead. Those of you who learned a second language, as you're getting used to that language, oh, I can't remember how to conjugate hablar. I mean, I can't say hablo, I'll just say hablar. So you think of the infinitive. So that's what she did. And it was so interesting to see how she was trying to maneuver these intricacies of the second language. Something about Cerruti that bothered me, and there are a couple things I'll tell you in a minute. He said that her language skills were quaint. That word bugged me. Does it bother you? Oh, she was quaint. Why couldn't he have said like she was masterful or it was wonderful that she tried? And you can interpret that in various ways. But I take it personally because as the granddaughter of a native Spanish speaker who really struggled to learn English, I view Isidora's willingness to speak to Cerruti in a language that was not her own as an expression of her strength as a woman, her dignity as a human being, and the pride that she felt for her people and her culture. She was brave, and this all comes across in the text. Now, Isidora shared some background about herself with Cerruti, and she said, I was Chief Solano's third wife. I belonged to Solano before I married him, and even before I was baptized. I am not a Susun like he is. I belong to the Chirrup tribe. My father's tribe lived near Cache Creek. You've all heard of Cache Creek, the casino up that way? Oh, okay. Wasn't there then. I do not know the name of the county to which it belongs today. On a trip Solano took there to do some negotiating, he stole me. My father and many Satayomi went after him, but they could not catch him. And she was really proud of the influence that she had on her husband, who was feared by white men and indigenous men alike. She says, whenever my husband would get angry, I would do everything possible to calm him down. The priest who baptized me and gave me the name Isidora Filomena taught me how to be very charitable toward the poor, very gentle with my husband, and very compassionate toward the prisoners. This is why I prevented my husband from killing enemy prisoners after he had conquered all of his enemies with the men he led. Back then, it was customary to tie the prisoner to trees and shoot arrows at them. I told him, leave them with Vallejo. He will make them work the land. The priest advised the same thing, and Solano followed our advice, and many poor souls were spared. Isidora was not a fan of Sutter. She said he was a trickster, he was a thief, and he was one of those blonde men. And she said he stole everything from the Indians. And she said Sutter and his men introduced us to alcohol. Isidora provides so much fascinating information about her people, such as details of their everyday life, what they look like, what they ate, and here we have an example of their numerical system. And she said, contrary to the stereotype held by many people that indigenous people were dirty, that they were not clean, she said that the Indians used amoles, or soap root, to bathe. The Indians like to bathe because cleanliness makes them strong. Amole removes all stains and does not burn your body or make your skin hurt. My people always had white teeth because they cleaned them with a stick called fresno. What tree is the fresno tree? Ash tree. Very good. My good student. Okay, very good. Now, this is the thing that really bothers me about Cerruti. He took advantage of her weakness for alcohol in order to basically steal a personal artifact from her. Isidora brought a bag in, and she said, I have something in here that I want to show you. And inside that bag was the wedding dress that she had kept all those years, and she wanted to be buried in that wedding dress. Every year, she would put new shells and new beads, and she was hoping that that way she could preserve it. Well, Cerruti said, okay, here's $10. Here's a $10 gold piece, rather, for the dress. Let me have it. And she laughed at him. Cerruti said she laughed at him. So can you imagine he was a little bit upset? He later offered her some more brandy. And he said, I'll pay you $24 for the dress, and I'll give you all the rest of the brandy in this bottle. And sadly, she accepted his offer. And then he says, and this is in the appendix of our book, he says, she could be considered a woman worthy of esteem if she did not allow herself to be controlled by the vice of drunkenness. I find that really offensive, and I could say a lot more about that, but I want to say Isidora was, in our opinion, and continues to be, a woman worthy of esteem and respect.
And before we leave that slide, the lady here is Marisa Luisa, one of Mariana Guadalupe Vallejo's daughters. And at the end of the 19th century, she's the one who was most responsible for making Lacrima Montes, the Vallejo home in Sonoma, a state historic park. And it still is a state historic park. And that was done basically by her. The next woman that Cerruti and Vallejo introduced was Rosalia Vallejo, Mariana Guadalupe Vallejo's sister. What they did, it's interesting how they got in touch with her, because they went down to Santa Clara and they wanted to interview Soledad Ortega, who was the widow of Luis Antonio Argüello, who was the first Mexican governor of Alta California, when Alta California passed from Spanish to Mexican control in 1821. Argüello was appointed by the Mexican government as governor. And Soledad Ortega was her widow. And what they wanted to do was see if she had any of the documents that Argüello had produced or got when he was governor. And when they were talking about this, one of her children, one of Soledad Ortega's children, came in and said, "Oh, you're looking for documents? Oh, you know, all those old papers, they were useless. I just got rid of all of them completely, and I burned them. I got rid of them, you know." And now Vallejo at this point is appalled, because, you know, he has presented himself to Bancroft as somebody who can connect Bancroft to important Californians, to important Mexicans. And to try to, you know, recover his standing with Bancroft, he says to Bancroft, "Okay, you know, we're in Santa Clara. Let's go down a little bit farther. Let's go down to Monterey. My sister lives down there, and I know that my sister would be willing to talk with you." And so they did. They went down there to Monterey and interviewed Rosalia. Rosalia had an interesting kind of background. In the 1820s, she and her brother Mariano had been invited to a 4th of July party in Yerba Buena. Yerba Buena was where San Francisco now is. And the 4th of July party was being held by a recently arrived American merchant and trader named Jacob P. Lease. And Lease wanted to invite the Mexicans here to kind of get himself involved in the Mexican community to become a more successful trader. Well, what happens is at that 4th of July party, Lease and Rosalia seem to have hit it off and became interested in each other. And they developed a kind of a correspondence back and forth. She's in Monterey and he's in Yerba Buena in San Francisco. And what happens is that they decide that they should get married. Mariano, her brother, is furious with this idea. He wanted Rosalia to marry Timothy Murphy, who was another American trader with whom Vallejo was very close. And so what happens is that Lisa's, you know, he's in Yerba Buena and Monterey are kind of main ports, so he becomes an important kind of guy. And he becomes kind of convinced that, you know, Alta California is not big enough for him. And he becomes involved in land speculation in Baja California. And so what happens is that they go and and by this time he has a number of children, as you can see on the screen. What happens is that he tells Rosalia that he's going to go down to Baja California because he thinks he has a land grant which is going to give him 2/3 of all of Baja California. Doesn't turn out to be that way. He goes down to Baja California, finds out that he's not going to get that land grant, and never returns to Alta California. He abandons Rosalia and all of her children. And so when she is being interviewed, she is raising all of these children by herself.
Yeah, and he married another woman too when he was back east.
Yeah, at least he goes back to the East Coast and gets married again.
God.
You know, he doesn't say that he was married, that he was already married. Oh, by the way, I have a wife, you know, in California. He gets married again
With 7 children. Really, dude. Well, this is the meat of the translation.
Yeah. What does Bancroft want to find out from Rosalia? He wants to find out about one thing.
Yeah, the bear flag. Well, good luck, Cerruti. This woman was somebody that you shouldn't mess with. She hated the Americans, and she said that she refused to learn English because she had this antagonism towards the Americans. But get this, the testimonio is written in English. It's written in English. And for me, well, you can tell it still bothers me after all these years. It was as if he were trying to have the last word here, but he couldn't strip her of her dignity. And we have the English testimonio in our appendix, so you can read it. And he had taken notes in Spanish, and what he did was he translated Spanish notes into English. I can tell, I taught Spanish. And he says, get this, few days after departure of my husband, arrived in Sonoma, John C. Fremont. Listen to the Spanish. Pocos días después de la ida de mi marido, llegó a Sonoma John C. Fremont. He just translated the English using the same Spanish syntax. Didn't work. I had to translate his English back into Spanish so that I could hear her voice, because her voice was gone in the English. Rosalia was highly critical of Fremont and his motives. She said, many paid writers have characterized Fremont with a great number of endearing epithets, but he was a tremendous coward. Listen to me. I have good reason to say this. Can you imagine that scene? Probably Cerruti's going like, yeah. And she's like, oígame. Listen to me. Strong. Okay. Now, the events that took place on June 14th, 1846 were so painfully fresh in her mind. She says that she knew that all the women in Sonoma were at risk, and she wanted to protect them from Fremont's ring of thieves, as she called them. For example, no woman would dare go out alone at night. On numerous occasions, Fremont ordered Rosalia to send one of her servants, who was a 17-year-old indigenous girl, to the officers' barracks to entertain them. But she said that she resorted to all sorts of tricks to spare the girl from falling into the hands of that band of thugs. Now, her final comments to Cerruti leave no doubt that she was totally traumatized by what took place on June 14th. I could tell you about the many crimes committed by the Bear Flag mob, but since I do not wish to detain you any longer, I will end this conversation with this. Those hateful men instilled so much hate in me for the people of their race that even though 28 years have gone by since then, I still cannot forget the insults they heaped upon me. Since I have not wanted to have anything to do with them, I have refused to learn their language.
The next interview that Cerruti undertook was of Josefa Carrillo de Fitch. Josefa Carrillo was from Southern California. She was actually a sister of Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo's wife, and she had married an American trader named Henry Delano Fitch. And you can see their picture there of her extended family in the late 19th century, and it's a large family. What had happened was that after her husband's death, Josefa inherited the rancho that he had. And it was in the North Bay area. Because under Mexican law, women could own property, which was different from American law, And so she inherited that rancho. And, like most rancho owners, she was kind of, when the gold rush comes in and Americans come in, they squat on the land and everything like that. And so what she has to do, and California passes a law called the California Land Act, which makes you prove that you actually own this land, and not, in Mexican California, everybody knew where my rancho was. It went from that grove of trees to that hill to that stream, and everybody knew that. But now you've got latitude and longitude and everything like this, and you have to prove that this speck of land is yours. And what happens is that a lot of people have to sell part of their land to pay lawyers to try to save the rest of it. And Josefa had to sell part of her land, and at an auction, she sold part of it to a man named Harmon Heald. And for the rest, and he got more and more of the land. And for the rest of her life, Josefa deeply resented the fact that she now lived in a place called Healdsburg. And she never liked that. And this is her house, which was in, her old rancho was Rancho Sotoyomi. And this is the house in which the interview of Josefa took place.
Take a look at that face. Think of Cerruti approaching her. Cerruti tries to break the ice with Josefa by beginning the interview with a question about her name, which she said was Maria Antonia Natalia Elija Carrillo de Fitch. but everybody just calls me Josefa. She explained that 3 days after she was born, Doña Josefa del Sal del Mercado took her to the church to be baptized. And when she brought the baby back home, her mother asked her, well, what was the name the baby had been given when she was christened? And Doña Sal said, I can't remember. So just call her Josefa for the time being, and that's the name that stuck. Josefa's feelings about the Americans were mixed, to say the least. She thought they were know-it-alls, and she called them Yankee savants. Cerruti picked up on this, of course he did, and pressed her to explain herself further. She said that in Napa County, there is a small river that the Californios and the Indians called Rio Putoy. But without permission, the Americans changed the name to Rio de los Putos. My grandmother is in her grave now spinning because I said that word. That's a very nasty word. She offered one more example of the know-it-all Americans. Point Quintin was named after an Indian who apparently was more of a demon than a saint. The Americans later named the area San Quentin. What amazed her the most about this is that there is no such saint as San Quintin or San Quentin. And the name changes made by the Americans were made by people who did not have the right to baptize anyone.
Yeah, Vallejo once said in another context is that he expected to have the Americans start calling that mountain in the Bay Area, which is Mount Diablo, Mount San Diablo.
Yeah,
You know?
everything is san, san, san. But this was the real story Cerruti wanted to hear about. In 1826, Captain Henry Delano Fitch arrived in San Diego, and he was a young man who really presented himself well. He had the manners of a real gentleman. So when the members of San Diego's high society discovered these qualities, little by little he was given entry into their circle, and he established good relations with the first families of San Diego, and he fell in love with Josefa. Now, Fitch asked Josefa's parents for her hand in marriage, and after pleading with them for a good amount of time, they finally consented to the union. In March 1829, her parents arranged for Dominican Father Antonio Menendez to come to their home to preside over the marriage ceremony, and they even had an altar built in their parlor. Now, you all know this, but it bears repeating. There was a strict law in place back then that mandated that all foreigners who wanted to marry an hija del país, or a daughter of the land, had to obtain permission to do so from the governor, and the governor could not grant permission without proper documentation saying that the person had converted to Catholicism. And, well, Fitch didn't prove that he was a Roman Catholic. Interesting. He had not sought permission from the governor, nor had he fulfilled the requirements of the church. Josefa's uncle, Domingo Carrillo, was adamantly opposed to his niece marrying a foreigner. So he went to Governor Echeandia and he said, please impose your authority so that this marriage is not going to take place. The governor then sent Carrillo to the bride's home to stop the wedding, which he did, saying that the appropriate documents had not been presented. Pio Pico, someone you all are familiar with, he was the bride's cousin, and he was in attendance at the wedding. He witnessed the whole scene. Thankfully, this guy was really creative, and he had a plan up his sleeve to help Josefa and Fitch. He told Fitch this: go back to your ship, make all the necessary preparations to set sail, prepare a cabin for your bride, and then quickly come back to shore and spread the word that you've decided that you don't want to get married and that you want to leave. And go and get the appropriate documents so that you can leave the country immediately and set sail for South America. Fitch agreed to the plan. And what happened next is that Pio Pico, and that's not supposed to be Fitch, it's Pio Pico, took his cousin Josefa on horseback to the beach so that she could meet up with Fitch at the designated spot. That spot is referred to today as Fitch Rock. And I learned that from Iris Engstrand, a very wonderful historian, who told me, yes, you've got to go see it. Fitch Rock is still there. Josefa and Fitch then rowed out to Fitch's ship that was anchored nearby. They sailed off to Chile, and they were married there. At the end of 1830, Fitch and Josefa returned to San Diego with their infant son. Babies have a way, don't they? Her mother and other female friends went to greet her on board the ship. And her mother said, Josefa, your father said that if he ever saw you again, he was going to kill you because you have stained the family honor by eloping with Fitch. That honor de la familia is so important. Well, Josefa said, no, I need to go home and make peace with my father. So she goes to the house, opens the door, there's her father behind a table with a shotgun in his hand. And he is threatening to kill her. I won't do this here because I might not be able to get up, but she got on her knees and she basically crawled on her knees to the table. And she explained to her dad, she said, the governor is to blame for everything that has happened. He is to blame because I think he was in love with me. Well, we found out later in Vallejo's story, in his recuerdos, and in other recuerdos, that the governor really was in love with her. So he didn't want her to marry Fitch at all. Now, this story of Josefa and Fitch's elopement became a part of California folklore, and it's referenced by many other people.
After dealing with Northern California, Bancroft decided that he wanted to go down to Southern California. And his companion in Southern California was a man named Thomas Savage. Savage had been born in Havana, Cuba, while his father was a member of the U.S. diplomatic delegation there in Cuba. So Savage was fluent in Spanish, and that made him a tremendous asset to Bancroft's team of interviewers. And the first person that they interviewed was Eulalia Perez. She was interviewed in the late 1870s. And here she is. She's a woman who contributed much to society. She was a woman of many identities. She was a mestiza. She was a wife, a mother, a midwife, a cook, supervisor. She was a seamstress, a teacher, and most of all, she was a survivor.
Now, she was born at the Presidio of Loreto in Baja California. Some of you were on a trip with us many years ago down to Loreto, so you saw that mission, and possibly born in 1768. When she was 15 years old, she married a Presidio soldier by the name of Miguel Antonio Guillen. They had 3 sons and 1 daughter while in Loreto, and 2 of the boys died there. Eulalia and her surviving son and daughter moved to San Diego in 1802, which is when her husband was transferred to the San Diego Presidio. The family lived at the Presidio until 1810. Now, Eulalia was a skilled midwife, and her services were in demand at the Presidio because she was the only woman who knew how to deliver babies. And she frequently traveled from San Diego to San Gabriel, which is a distance of, and I looked it up, 125 miles. And she would come to assist women in labor. And she recalled that she was the woman who delivered Pio Pico, the guy I just talked about, who helped Josefa get married. Now, Eulalia and her family eventually moved to San Gabriel when her husband was posted there to serve in the Mission Guard. But he became ill and he died in 1815, and she and her family decided, well, we'll just stay here permanently. So now that she was a widow, she had to find a way to support her family. And fortunately, midwifery was not her only skill. She was also an excellent cook. And I would say she had good people skills, and the friars could depend on her, like the friars could depend on Apolinaria at San Diego. They were very aware of her family situation, and they were looking for a way to help her without taking away work from other women, because that would upset them. And they didn't want any assistance they were giving her to look like a form of charity, so they came up with this plan. The friars decided that they were going to hold a cooking contest, and they encouraged Eulalia to be one of the contestants. Now, in her testimonial, she said that there were 2 other women in the area who were excellent, experienced cooks, and they would be called upon to prepare meals on important feast days. But they couldn't handle all of the culinary demands at the mission, so they really did need another cook, so it wasn't, a plan, so to speak. They needed a cook who could teach the Indians how to cook for the friars. Now, one of the 2 experienced cooks, her name was Maria Luisa Cota, and her husband was the wife of the mayordomo at the mission. His name was Claudio Lopez. I mention that because it'll be important in a moment. This is the way the contest worked. The 2 expert cooks and Eulalia Perez would each cook 3 meals for a panel of 8 judges on designated days. One of the judges was the mission mayordomo, Claudio Lopez. Maria Luisa Cota's husband. Now, Eulalia described the contest, her turn in the contest, like this. When it was my turn to cook, I made several soups, a variety of meat dishes, and anything else that came to mind that I knew how to make. The judges came at dinner time. After they finished the meal, Father Sanchez asked them what they thought of my food. The oldest man pondered for quite some time. He said that it had been many years since he had eaten as well as he had that day. He doubted that a person would eat better food at the king's table. The other men also praised the meal highly. Based on this, I was given a job at the mission. Wouldn't you have liked to have been a fly on the wall in the room of Maria Cota and her husband? You didn't vote for me for that job? Oh my God, drama. Now, winning this contest was just the beginning of her important career at San Gabriel. She also had good people skills, and the friars could depend on her for that. Soon she was in charge of cutting and making clothes and other items for the vaqueros. She was also the llavera, or the keeper of the keys, and was in charge of distributing food for the Indians, as well as clothing. I would say that we could call her, well, we use the term chief operations officer, we could call her that at Mission San Gabriel, and she was the glue that kept Mission San Gabriel running. I wanted to point out that the faces here, if you notice, those are indigenous faces. Those are all indigenous people trying out the tallow. We can also add ranch owner to her resume. With mission secularization on the horizon, the missionaries at San Gabriel were looking for ways in which at least a portion of the mission lands would end up in the hands of those who were friendly to the mission system. So in 1834, Eulalia and her second husband, Juan Mariné, were granted a large rancho, San Pascual. That rancho is now the site of the cities of Pasadena and Altadena. Not bad real estate, right, Greg? Pretty good. Now, throughout her lifetime, Eulalia demonstrated that she was an independent woman with a strong sense of self. With pride, she would claim that she was never, ever going to ride in a fancy carriage. She preferred to ride in a carreta because it has so much more leg room.
And she was also a celebrity. She was something of a tourist attraction by this time, a tourist attraction in Southern California. Local boosters were touting her advanced age as evidence that living in Southern California, where the climate was great and the air was clean, was good for your health. And in fact, in June 1876, her daughter Maria Antonia contracted to have Eulalia exhibited in San Francisco and then taken to the Centennial Exposition, the World's Fair in Philadelphia in 1876 as, quote, the oldest woman in the world. Her daughter was going to receive $5,000 for this 6-week tour. And these 3 photos were used as marketing tools for the Philadelphia Exposition. But another daughter, Maria del Rosario, helped put a stop to this by catching up with Eulalia and her sisters in Los Angeles as they were headed back east, and so she never made it to the World's Fair. The last person, Thomas Savage, was very excited about the interview he was going to conduct in Santa Barbara with a woman named Angustias de la Guerra, because she and her family had been, and still were, very well connected with all facets of California society, especially the military and the church. And Angustias had long and close relationships, ties to Anglos. Among her in-laws was an American merchant named Alfred Robinson, who in 1846 wrote a book called Life in California, which is very popular in the East Coast. And Robinson was married to Angustias' sister, Anita de la Guerra. Now, Vallejo and other Californios who read Robinson's book felt that the book was only loosely based on fact, and therefore could not be viewed as a faithful representation of life in California or of the Californios. This is what Robinson said. He said, "The men in Alta California. The men are generally indolent and addicted to many vices, caring little for the welfare of their children, who, like themselves, grow up unworthy members of society. This was a very popular book in the East Coast. Robinson's core statement was not true. The Californios were extremely interested in education and in creating significant educational opportunities for their children. Circling back for a moment to Apolinaria Lorenzana, you will recall that she did know how to read and that she taught herself how to write, and she valued education. But she was not the only Alta California woman who spoke on the topic of education. Maria Inocento Pico de Avila described in her own reminiscences what school was like for girls.
At school, they taught us how to read and write, and also the 4 rules of arithmetic with whole numbers. Many girls did not complete even those basic subjects because their mothers would take them out of school almost always to marry them off. The bad custom existed of marrying off very young girls whenever a man asked for their hand. I was in school only until the age of 14, which is when my mother took me to the rancho to show me how to work. I got married when I was 15 years and 8 months old. The fact that she remembers 15 years and 8 months makes me think that she wasn't too happy about having to get married.
So when Thomas Savage interviewed Angustias de la Guerra Ord, this is what he said about the interview.
I had hoped to obtain from her much information on manners and customs of the Californios, which would no doubt have been interesting and reliable, as proceeding from a lady of her intellectual and social standing, but a regard for her distressed condition of mind deterred me from occupying her attention any longer.
But some information does come across in her interview and in the personal journal that she dictated to her daughter Rebecca, which we include in an appendix to our book. Now, Angustias' distressed condition of mind, which Savage talked about, was because one of her brothers was quite ill, and she was spending a lot of time trying to nurse him back to health. Now, Angustias had been born in 1815 in San Diego. She was one of the daughters of José de la Guerra y Noriega, who later became the commander of the Presidio in Santa Barbara. And this De la Guerra house, which is on De la Guerra Street in Santa Barbara, and some of you have probably been there, this is where Savage interviewed Angustias. And this is what the parlor of the house looks like. Now, in 1833, when she was 18 years old, Angustias married Manuel Jimeno Casarin, and he moved to Monterey. Jimeno Casarin was a member of the governor, whose name was Manuel Michel Torena, a member of the governor's staff in Monterey before American forces occupied the town in 1846. There's a drawing of the main street in Monterey, and you can see where the Jimeno home is in relationship to a bunch of other things in Monterey. So it was right there in the center of town. Now, Angustias' testimony is closer in theme to many of the interviews that were done by men, but she does give it her own flavor and her own sassiness, as expressed in her description of something that happened at a dance on February 22nd, today, 1847, that was held at the house of American consul in Monterey, whose name was Thomas O. Larkin. And the dance was held to honor the arrival of Archibald Gillespie, who was supposed to help Larkin. Larkin's job as consul was to persuade the Californios that they should join the United States. That was his job. And Gillespie was a military officer. And this is what she said.
Larkin introduced Gillespie to the upper crust of Monterey society at a dance he hosted in his home. He told us that Senor Gillespie was an ill man who had come to travel through California to see if his health might improve. He arrived in San Francisco on an American warship. I must confess that neither I nor Senora Spence was deceived by that so-called introduction. We found it difficult to understand why the U.S. government would send an entire warship just to bring an ill young man to California. We brought this to Jose Castro's attention, but Castro told us that we were thinking badly of a man who was ill. He accused us, and all women in general, of thinking badly of others. which according to Castro was something women did much more than men. Our response to Castro was that women almost always hit the nail on the head more often than men do.
Now, Angustias was friendly in Santa Barbara with many American officers, and she saw no reason to behave otherwise, even though she feared that the American regime was going to bring difficult changes to her country. And in her interview, this is what she said.
The Californians were not happy at all with the conquest of California, least of all the women.
Now, Angustias and Manuel Jimeno Casarin had a strained marriage, and they were at odds over many things, such as financial and family matters. They would eventually separate before Manuel Casarin died in 1853. And 3 years later, on October 31st, 1856, in San Francisco, Angustias married Dr. James Lycurgus Ord, who was an Army physician and the brother of Lieutenant Edward C. Ord, after whom Fort Ord is actually named. Now, circling back to that February 22nd, 1847 dance at Larkin's house, Angustias there at that dance met another American officer by the name of Alfred Sully. Now, he was the son of the famous American portrait painter Thomas Sully. And little did she know that Alfred Sully was going to play an important role in her life. Has anybody ever heard of the American portrait painter Thomas Sully? If those of you who haven't, you may have a picture of him that he did in your wallet, because he did the picture of Andrew Jackson that appears on the $20 bill.
You have artwork in your wallet.
Alfred Sully had graduated from West Point in 1841, and he had served in the Mexican War. And part of the curriculum at West Point at the time included courses in civil engineering, topography, and drawing, because these guys were going to be explorers, and they had to know how to do maps and things like that. And so when he arrived in California, Sully was ordered to garrison duty. He arrived in Monterey in April of 1849, and he was assigned as quartermaster. He was 29 years old at the time. And soon after he landed in Monterey, he made the acquaintance of Angustias de la Guerra, whom we've just been talking about, whom he later called La Doña, very nice term, in correspondence to his family. Officers such as Sully found Angustias to be a very gracious hostess who looked after them. And this is how Sully described Angustias in a letter to his sister Blanche. He said,
"She is a tall, majestic-looking woman, about 30 or 35, remarkably handsome, very agreeable, very good-natured, and very smart. In fact, she is a well-read woman and would grace any circle of society."
And here's a Sully painting of Monterey. And now, since at this time Angustias' husband, Manuel Jimeno, was away, and then, as I said earlier, they were having problems, and there was no male in the house, Angustias asked Sully to stay with them in the house. But this was not considered improper at the time, because the house was filled with many servants and many other family friends, including Angustias' oldest daughter, Manuela, who was 15 years old, and 15 years old was of marriageable age.
And this is how Sully described her. "Manuela was remarkably pretty and gay. She dances and sings and plays the guitar, and like all Spanish girls, monstrous fond of a flirtation. I fear she finds this rather a hard job with me, for my bad Spanish always sets her a-laughing. However, that doesn't prevent me from having a very agreeable time of it, for she has a good figure, a good foot and ankle, small hands, brilliant black eyes, white teeth, red cheeks, and she's as lively as a cricket."
Now, Sully sent a daguerreotype, a primitive photograph of Manuela, to his father, Thomas Sully, who painted this miniature picture of her. But Alfred Sully complained that his father had not captured her smile.
"It is not quite smiling enough."
Now, Sully fell in love with Manuela, and he wanted to marry her. But she had many suitors, and he was afraid that he would lose her. And he also feared that her parents would object to the marriage because, as he wrote,
"I have nothing to offer except my good family background and reputation." Now, when he asked Angustias and Jimeno for permission to discuss marriage with Manuela, they agreed thinking that Manuela was only flirting with him and that she would thus refuse a proposal. And they had plans to marry her off to a wealthy relative. But much to their surprise, Manuela accepted Sully's marriage proposal. Her parents and many Mexicans in town objected to the marriage because Sully was not a Catholic. He said, "The whole of Monterey turned against me and used all arguments and invented all kinds of lies to assist the parents and oppose our union. This had no other effect on the girl than to make her more firm." Now, you saw that before. I think you're going to know where I'm going with this. Sully had no intention of converting to Catholicism. He had a friend ride to San Francisco to obtain a dispensation from Bishop González Rubio for a Catholic to marry a non-Catholic. In the meantime, Sully made arrangements so that he and Manuela could get married in Monterey at the home of Captain Elias Kane. And they could do that as soon as the friend returned with that dispensation. And here's the choreography of the wedding ceremony. He could have been a great wedding planner, this guy. Sully arranged for Manuela to be invited to the Kane home on Monday, May 20th, 1850. Angustias agreed to let her daughter go, as long as she was accompanied by a chaperone, who happened to be a young man who admired Manuela. Sully hid in some bushes outside the house with the priest, who had agreed to perform the ceremony because of that dispensation. Sully arranged for another friend of his to drop by accident, and his job was to distract Manuela's chaperone. Then Manuela was escorted into the kitchen. Then someone in the house waved a white flag to signal to Sully and the priest that they could come out of hiding and go into the kitchen. 5 minutes later, Sully and Manuela were married. This is a true story, I kid you not. Now, I'm showing this picture. It's of an older Angustias. Forget the white hair. Focus on the face, okay? Focus on this grim face. Sully wrote that Manuela's parents were as mad as hell at him. When he went to see them, they told him to never show his face again. Her parents kept all her belongings, including her clothing. But a few months later, they sent the couple some expensive gifts, such as a satin bedspread embroidered with silk and lace-embroidered linen sheets. Sully wrote that that bedspread must have cost $200. So they can't be that mad, is what he said. Now, Manuela's parents agreed to a reconciliation. When do you think and why do you think they agreed to that? Having a baby, okay? Yep, when they learned she was pregnant. They wanted Sully to resign from the army and to settle down. And to facilitate this, they were willing to give him part of their rancho. Manuela's father persuaded Sully to take a 2-mile square section of the ranch and develop it. So Sully built a sawmill on the land, and he was looking for a place on the land to build a flour mill. On March 15th, 1851, a messenger caught up with Sully to tell him that Manuela had just given birth to a boy. She was attended to by her mother and 2 older women because there was no doctor within 30 miles. They named the boy Thomas Manuel Sully after his grandfathers. Sully then began to contemplate his future as a rancher in California, and he said that he was truly happy for the first time since he had left home. On March 28, 1851, less than 2 weeks after giving birth, Manuela became violently ill after eating an orange given to her by a former suitor. Supposedly, this man was jealous, and he had poisoned the fruit. She suffered terribly, and she died a violent death the next day. But it's most likely that she died from cholera. The final blow for Sully came on April 15, 1851. Angustias had recently given birth herself, and she was taking care of Manuela's infant. That night, when she took little Thomas to bed with her, she fell asleep with the baby in her arms, and when she woke up, he was dead. Angustias had accidentally strangled the baby in her sleep. Dr. Ord, her future husband, told Angustias that the baby had died of a convulsion, but he told Sully, and only Sully, the truth. Sully did not attend the funeral, and he wrote, "I have been robbed of a treasure that can never be replaced. I shall leave this place as soon as I can. I will give up my rancho and mill, for I have no intention now of leaving the army. Before I leave, I shall erect a tomb to mark the grave of my wife and child. The slab with this inscription I expect soon from San Francisco. And there you have the inscription. This story tugged at my heart, and I really wanted to find that slab. So on our wedding anniversary, I said to Bob, let's go see if we can find this. So we did. We went to the cemetery near the estuary in Monterey, and we found the slab. It was all covered with grass, and the groundskeeper was so
The
happy.
groundskeeper was wonderful.
Oh, he was
Yeah.
great. He said, I'm so happy that somebody's interested in this. So you can see he cleaned it all up for us, and there you have the slab that had been standing, but then it was knocked down.
Now, remember, when Savage started interviewing, wanted to interview Angustias de la Guerra, she said, I can't do it right now because my brother is sick and I got to take care. And they said, well, we come a long way. What else, what else would you recommend? And he said, if you go to the Mission Church in Santa Barbara, there are some houses right behind the church. And there's an old lady who lives there. And maybe she'd talk to you. And so they did. And who do you think that old lady was?
Who do you think it was? It was Apolinaria. It was Apolinaria Lorenzana.
And so if Angustias' brother had not been sick, we would know nothing about Apolinaria Lorenzana.
And this is how she ended her testimonial. I had the satisfaction of being loved by young and old and rich and poor. Maybe it was because I was good-natured and would do whatever I could to help people. I imagined that if I went to San Diego, I would be well received. But I live far away and I am blind, and those people are not in a very good position to help me. So here I am, poor, weak, and in failing health. I will manage like this until God calls me to his bosom. You notice her hand, the left hand, the one that had been paralyzed. You see she still kind of cradles it. I just love the fact that her voice is out there for all of you to read. This child who had been abandoned in a window. And here we have her. We thank you for your kind attention. This has been so lovely to share these women that we love so very much. I never tire of talking to them. I get all teary-eyed at the end always. I hope that you will take a look at our book. There are many other things. This is just a quick overview. And you've been a wonderful audience. I hope that you'll stay for our next talk because it's even better. Thank you, thank you, thank you.